The Season 21 FNCS Grand Finals was some of the most exciting we've ever seen, with many incredible performances and the titles coming down to the wire on several regions. On EU we had a great battle during which 659,513 damage was dealt, 212,968 builds were placed, 3,424 kilometers were run, and over 10 hours was spent in the storm. But some players did way more than their fair share in each category, so let's see who they were and who I think the best player in the whole tournament was. Starting with the most eliminations, we have Moustache on 27, who was the only player who had 6 elims in 2 different games. He was closely followed by our newly crowned FNCS champion, Vidil. These two players always get many accolades for their fragging, but some underrated names on here, like Vico and Flixie, who both finished outside the top 10 overall, definitely pulled their weight in eliminations. The most in one game was 8 from T-Chips in game 9 and also Queasy in game 8, while the most for a duo was 13 from Queasy and Vino in that same game. For damage dealt, Vino is the clear winner. He is the player who got over 16,000 damage, and even if he didn't defend his FNCS title from the previous season, he is still the 2-time damage champion of FNCS after topping the stat last time. This time he was almost 4,000 ahead of his nearest challenger, which is a crazy gap. We're going to come back to him soon though, so let's move on for now. Here we have the damage taken by each player, where at the top we tend to see players who were effective at trading damage and healing up repeatedly, usually very good surge players, and you can call them survivors. Robin apparently was very effective at doing this. And at the bottom we see some of the teams who didn't do well in the tournament because they only take 100 to 200 damage without healing at all in each game that they die off spawn. And those last two stats bring us nicely to the damage ratio, where we combine damage dealt against damage taken to see who had the best combination. And this is where Vino goes absolutely crazy. He won by miles. If I show you all 100 players in order of their damage ratio, you see just how much of an anomaly he was. The average player is under 1 because storm damage and surge counts against your damage taken, but nobody deals that damage to you except the Fortnite gods. So only 15 players dealt more damage than they took, yet he was over double that. We can take a look at his zone breakdown now, with blue showing damage dealt and red the damage taken. As you can see, his early game is amazing, but zones 4 to 6 were the most spectacular, often doing 4 times as much damage as he was taking. The very end of his games weren't quite as impressive, which just reflects how they weren't able to take and keep height as often as they would have wanted. Now one more damage stat, which is the leaders in the most damage per zone, where Vino had the most damage dealt of any player in zones 1, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Tayson unsurprisingly had the most damage before zone 1 even appeared, while Andy was forced into action in zone 2 to get enough surge. No team really dominated the endgames, but Vidil was usually there and he had the most in zone 7, while Thomas HD had zones 8 and 9. Enough gushing over Vino's damage, so here's a stat I haven't pulled out before. The most time spent in Storm went to Clinbury, who had the equivalent of almost an entire game in the Storm, with his duo Marco just a little behind. Their landing spot on Edge map no doubt contributed to this, with one game alone having 5 minutes of time in the Storm. The difference to the bottom teams was huge, with Podesai and Exuis spending under 1 minute each, partly thanks to only surviving 5 times off spawn and also being mid-map. The most requested stat last time I did a video like this was the total distance that a player ran, so here it is. Note that this isn't actually a measure of how lucky any teams were with zones, because if you land edge map you should expect some far zones. However, look at the team on top and notice how Vidil and Janice actually won the entire tournament. In some ways this is extremely surprising, as you would expect that the team that won might have some nearby zones. On the other hand, the winning team will always have survived a long time into each game and will therefore undoubtedly run a decent distance in total. Now this distance of over 99 kilometers equates to over a marathon each, or just over 4 kilometers per game. That takes us nicely into figuring out which teams did have lucky zones and which were unlucky. Here's a map of all the Zone 4 locations. Day 1 was fairly well distributed but quite central generally. Day 2 was lucky for the north teams it seems, but can we put that into numbers to prove it? Of course we can. I got the 4th zones from 50,000 games since the last update and worked out the average distance that each landing location should expect to run to get to a 4th zone. Then I compared it to how far they did have to go in the 12 games, and these were the results. T-Chips and Art Skill were the most lucky, travelling 29% less distance than average zones would have made them. The luckiest teams for zones were mostly north ones, confirming what we thought when we saw the map of the zones. On the contrary, it was south teams that got the bad end of things, while poor QB and Frodoxy travelled up to 25% further than expected due to switching drop spots at unlucky times. The tournament winners, Vidil and Janice, did have slightly bad zones, going 6% further than expected, although they had extra bad luck when the Greasy Grove zone appeared in the game that they died early. But do far zones actually have a bad effect on placement? Last season I found that really near zones were worth about 5 placements compared to really far zones. Cars had been removed not long before those finals, so some duos struggled a lot to adapt that quickly and couldn't deal with the far zones. I ran the same analysis, and this time it was extremely inconclusive for the very far zones, but in general, very near zones seem to help by about 2 placements. I think there is a smaller effect than there used to be because rotations and mid-game are all about surge now, and having great zones isn't as helpful as it used to be because you still need to go and find people to tag constantly. We've seen enough about damage from the fraggers earlier, so let's put some respect on the tarpers of EU. Pink was the player who placed the most builds with a total of 4,480 at 373 per game, which was double the number that his duo Anas placed. This was the highest disparity of any duo, showing that Pink is the de facto IGL and tarper for them. And that's the type of player we generally see in the rest of the list, with Paco, Queasy, Malabuka and iDrop all well known as taking on that role. The duo that were the most balanced on builds placed were Tayson and Chapix, who placed 3,373 and 3,367 builds respectively, for a difference of just half a build per game. Now let's go back to Vidil and Janice, and they had to rotate so far as we saw, and surely they should have been more scuffed on loot and mats than most of the teams going into endgame. Well, this is actually where we see that wasn't the case. Here are the teams with the most builds on average at the end of the 50-50 zone. If you are the team with the most mats going into moving zones, and you are there every game, you are almost certain to be near the top of the leaderboard, and that was the case for Vidil and Janice. They set themselves up for the tournament win with their play before moving zones. Their endgames were decent, but nothing spectacular, considering they had so many mats going into them. Second placed Podosai had a lot of mats when they made it to the moving zones, but they weren't there in most games, likewise with some of the other teams in the list. Now if we look at the end of the first zone, we already see that Vidil and Janice are there, despite there being a lot of far zones for them. This was thanks to their smart rotations that already put them on track to win it all. So when you're reviewing their games, make sure to take a close look at their early and mid games to see how they preserved all their resources into the end games. Finally, we come to the last section where I have to pick an MVP, and that's tough because there are so many great performances every time, but I would say that Vino edges this one. Not many people noticed the absolutely crazy damage that he was handing out, and this was a step up from his already very high standards. To be that far ahead of everyone in the surge and fragging department is unheard of. In second, I would put Pink, who rated 4th on damage, despite being an IGL and tarper who placed the most builds of anyone, and he also had some nice clutch moments. And of course we should mention Vidil and Janice. Firstly, Vidil was amongst the best fraggers and clutched some important moments such as the game 3 win, and then Janice, who IGL'd the duo to victory from a drop spot that didn't have great zones or good surge opportunities. I hope you enjoyed that dive into the stats of the final. Let me know who you were impressed by in the tournament in the comments, and I'll see you next time.